ask whatever questions that you have as they come up. And again, if I don't see it in the chat and it goes past the point of that topic, just literally chime in, okay? Speak up and we'll definitely answer your question. So let me share my screen. If I remember how to do this, this has been a while. Share screen, okay. And again, these slides will be online at the end of this as well. So you're more than welcome to take a look at these. Long before we had COVID, I used to do this before we took tests. And it was always called on demand because we recorded it and you could go back and watch it. So if you see things that say on demand, that was what this was called before we had COVID and Zoom and all that. So we're going to go through all of these items, some of them a little more focused than others. So if there is anything here that I don't touch upon, or you want more information, or you want to clarify, I'm also going to talk through pictures, which is sort of my lecture style normally. But I can always go back and rephrase things. So again, this is how our progression as we went through the unit. This was how this was. Our pictures and our sequence is going to be a little bit different just because I'm trying to stay true to how the College Board does it by objective. Okay, so but anyway, these are all going to be our topics. And if there's anything on that list that I don't cover, you want more information about, please just ask. Okay, so what I want to start with is the market revolution. And again, we're in the antebellum period. So we're 1790 to about 1848, 1850. And we are a thematic unit, but I'm going to try to kind of keep as much as I can sort of chronological in all of that. But the United States, right, becomes a country as of 1776, but we're not going to see kind of our modern country evolve until 1787 in the Constitution. And we're going to see within a couple of years what is the beginning of the mechanization of labor. So prior to 1790, even in the advanced Western world, as they thought of themselves, people were doing like this lady. They were hand spinning yarn. It was a time of cottage industries because you did this work in your house. The spinning wheel would have been in her home. There were basic hand looms that would have been your home. If you made candles, you were a blacksmith. Even if you were working with something like fire, this was done, in a little building in your backyard. So we're going to see what's going to happen over the course of the 1790s, early 1800s, is work is going to get dislocated. It's going to go to this new place called the factory. And that's where we combine the factors of production. If you remember that from civics. But we're going to see that entrepreneurs take land, labor, and capital, and they bring their workers to a central location. So between these two pictures, these people are both spinning, but obviously this woman, with the help of the machinery she works, she is spinning dozens and dozens of individual spools of wool. In this case, this woman, she's doing it one at a time. Okay, so with this mechanization of labor, greater productivity, but society is going to change because of it. People are going to go to work, predominantly men, but we know in places like Lowell, right? We saw women in Lowell, Massachusetts at that factory, and certainly child labor. Why women and children? Because you could pay them less. This is laissez-faire economics. There is no regulation. So in this time period, we're seeing big upheavals and transitions. And that's part of what the College Board wants you to get your mind kind of wrapped around, that we're seeing an American culture develop because we're in the aftermath of sort of our finalized, if you will, system of government, although we keep amending our Constitution. But we're also seeing some big significant changes in other ways, including technologically. Okay, so we start with the market revolution. And this type of cotton spinning that this woman is doing, this was probably done in a place that used water power. Northeast, they built lots of factories east of the fall line, and they would literally use water power to move these mills. By about 1810, we see the advent of the steam engine. So Robert Fulton uses it for ships, right, for boats. It's how the canal age is born. We'll see within about another 20 years, another transportation revolution taking place, and that will be locomotives. But the most significant forms of transportation certainly from about 1790 to about 1820, is actually going to be the building of turnpikes. So we think of building a road today and putting down some pavement as nothing sophisticated, but this was cutting edge technology in 1800. And you can see these men in my lower left-hand side of my screen, right? The work they're doing. But this turnpike, literally you paid money just like a turnpike today, but at the end of it, there was a pike and you had to pay your money to be able to get off that road or enter onto that road to utilize it. So that was the early part of the transportation revolution that's happening simultaneously to this market revolution. Things like the Erie Canal. This is more than 340 miles long. It connects ultimately what is this natural long Hudson River that runs north-south through New York State and is now being able to carry goods east-west. And that's probably the most important thing to understand about the transportation revolution. Certainly prior to the Civil War, it's almost solely confined to the north, and it's people moving geographically to the west and back to the east. So where people might be growing wheat and corn and other staple crops in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio, those would be traveling along something like the Erie Canal back to the Hudson River and then down the Hudson River to New York City and maybe even on ships out to the Atlantic. But this is all moving east-west. So when we talk about sectionalism, right, nationalism and sectionalism are two big themes of this unit. Part of the reason sectionalism evolves beyond the issue of slavery, but with the market revolution, we don't see North and South both embarking on this market revolution and in industry of some kind. We see the South greater entrenched in its agricultural production and the North more and more focused on its factory production. And where it is still farming and producing staple goods, those things are being traded east-west more often than they are north-south. Really, the big north-south relationships that happen economically are still going to happen by ocean-going vessels that go to the ports along the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast and using what would be the Mississippi River. But we're not going to really see any kind of east-west development, certainly not of any kind of infrastructure in the South, really not until after the Civil War. Ooh, so I'm gonna go back one. So part of this is going to be supported by the national government, or attempt to be, through what was known as the American system. So Henry Clay's brilliant idea, or so he thought, and his supporters did, in 1816, when he said, let's go back to things that we had before the War of 1812. We had a national bank then, we should have a national bank again. It's a good idea. So they chartered the second national bank. He said that American business was protected by tariffs before the War of 1812. After the War of 1812, we should still go back to that. And now that we have all these textile factories, it becomes even more important that Americans are supporting those businesses. But again, these things, whether they were intended to or not, maybe grow the national economy, but most of that economic growth is actually happening in the North. And Southerners saw that because tariffs didn't protect them and the price of cotton, but it artificially kept the prices of finished goods made in the North high. He also believed that all this tariff money could be used for infrastructure. So we were going to build roads and bridges and canals. The federal government only built one road of significance. It was called the National Road, and it goes through part of Maryland and what is now West Virginia. And it was all of 16 miles long. So the federal government really didn't do much in terms of making any kind of major infrastructure development. Something like the Erie Canal, that was the state of New York that did that. Most of the canals and railroads that were built through private means. And we can see that in the Supreme Court cases that encourage competition, those that support things like the national government in terms of banking. These are all initiatives that might be beneficial to the national economy as a whole, but it tended to only really benefit economically the North so much more than the South. So the other significant thing when we start talking about sectionalism, and we certainly can see that in debates over things like the tariff and the national bank, is that this debate over slavery is growing in intensity. So in 1790, there were still plenty of people that thought slavery would phase out, that things like the cotton gin hadn't been developed yet. There was no mechanization of textile weaving. But by the early 1800s, now we have this cotton-based economy that's booming. And for those who are growing cotton and making money growing cotton in the South, they need ever more land. So that's going to connect to things like Indian removal. It's also going to show us this great impetus for what we'll later call manifest destiny. People need to go west, and they need to be able to. The United States until 1803, right, was essentially landlocked to the east of the Mississippi River. With the Louisiana Purchase, this now was giving another third of the North American continent to the United States. But what to do in that region? So by 1820, it was apparent that people who owned slaves in the South, this cotton-based agriculture, had money and wanted to go west. But every time we entered new states into the Union, it came back to where is the legislative power nationally? Is it going to be in the hands of Northern industrialists, or is it going to be in the hands of Southern slave owners? And every time we add a state, right, we're adding potentially, if it's a free state, 2 senators that are probably going to support these Northern initiatives. And if they are a slave state, then those that support this pro-slavery Southern agenda. So by 1820, the question was, every time a new state is going to come into the Union, how are we going to settle whether or not it can enter as a slave state or a free state? So we had an even number of each in 1820, and then Missouri wanted to enter the Union. And at that point, those who were abolitionists, those who did not want to see slavery spread west, wanted to have their senators not accept Missouri as a state. And there was really no way to stop that. The precedent had been set. 60,000 people, they write a constitution, this is what they agreed to, and then they get rubber stamped by the national government. So we need a compromise. We need something that's going to let these people who don't want another slave state enter the Union, let another slave state enter the Union. And that's where we get Maine. So Maine until 1820 was this northern sort of annexed area of Massachusetts. And Henry Clay does his first of many compromises. And he says, look, if we can bring Maine into the Union as a free state, and we'll bring Missouri in as a slave state, and we will simply draw a line at 3630 across the Louisiana Purchase. And at that point, any other states that want to enter the Union that come from this territory, if they're below the line, they can become slave states. If they're above the line, they'll be free states. That seemed like an easy solution. And it lasts 34 years until we have the Compromise of 1850 and leading into what's the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is part of our 5.1 lesson. We will see this hold true as the way in which we will be bringing states into the Union. Obviously, as time goes on, by the 1830s and early 1840s, we're going to be dealing with Texas and all this land here, and it's going to make this slavery debate even more complicated. So when we look at sort of the themes of Unit 4, one of the really important ones is the fact that although the United States was a democratic republic at its founding, very few people actually could vote, right? We know minorities couldn't vote, women couldn't vote, but most men could not vote. So by 1824, only about 27% of men, adult men in this country, could vote. You had to own land, or you had to have assets that were taxable. And you were paying a certain amount of tax per year to your state. That made you eligible to vote. So there's going to be a huge upheaval between 1824 and 1840 because states that had not been part of the Union when our Constitution was written, states like Ohio and Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, Alabama, Mississippi, as they come into the Union, the people who went out west, some of them were relatively young, and then most of them had very little money. And so the attitude was that they were going to become a state of these people who were hardworking, but maybe didn't have a lot of material wealth, that as Americans, they should at least be able to vote. And so we are going to see nearly overnight the way people vote and elections change massively. And in 1824, we have that crazy election with Jackson and John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay and what becomes the corrupt bargain. But In the days leading up to that election, what has become apparent is that we've had the first part of our history, our first 6 presidents were all elite people. They were some way connected to the revolution. Even John Quincy Adams was a young man when his dad was writing the Declaration of Independence. And by 1824, we can have this poor young man who rises to great fame and all sorts of accolades in his military career. But Jackson is going to be a sort of a mythological figure because he truly is the common man. So we often refer to the antebellum period beginning around 1824 through about 1844 as the era of the common man, simply because the common man gets to participate. And we're getting what we will eventually call universal white male suffrage. But it's going to have some downsides as well. So even though we have a lot more people participating in elections, it means that it's really hard for political parties to sort of just simply choose who is going to be the winner. It's not necessarily elites that control all the power now. There's going to be a little more sharing of power. But Jackson in 1824, he doesn't win, although he gets the popular vote. As you know, there was no clear electoral winner. And so he does not win. It goes to the House of Representatives. We think there was a backdoor deal between Henry Clay, who suddenly goes from being Speaker of the House to Secretary of State for John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams is made the winner. But Jackson gets even, and he gets even with the help of Martin Van Buren. And they spend the next 4 years building what will become the Democratic Party. It is going to be the party of the common man. It certainly was in its inception, and still in many ways is perceived to be a party of non-elites. But Jackson is seen as a man of the people. He is essentially the dream that every American who doesn't have a lot has for their kid, that you can have very little, but be willing to work hard and have, smarts, and somehow you will be successful. So Old Hickory, as was his nickname, if you remember, he was somebody who got in a couple scrapes. He was involved in battles. He had a couple bullets in him from battles and duels. And like hickory wood, which is really tough and can take lots of violence to it before a hickory tree will die. That's how he got his nickname, Old Hickory, because he was tough as that kind of wood. But he's going to build literally a new way of campaigning. He's going to encourage people to want to come out to vote because who they're voting for is somebody who they hope to be. They see him as just like them, but also the person that they want to be one day or have their children be. But not everybody likes Jackson, right? The party that rises in opposition to the Democrats is the Whigs. And now we have that famous picture of King Andrew I. And for those of you who've already had class, we've been doing a little practice with this one. And we'll practice a little bit more if you're going to be in class tomorrow for a day. But it's important for us to be able to understand that with the political cartooning at the time, for every person who was for Jackson, he did have his critics. And Whigs were critical of him really for a couple of reasons. The most important one was this power of the veto. So Jackson saw it representing the common man because as president, he was sort of the final say on what Congress was going to do. And in his mind, most of Congress was full of elite people. The average person in America didn't vote for a member of the Senate. At the time, state legislatures voted for the Senate. And so he was like, unless you're voting for your local congressman, casting your vote for Jackson was probably the closest representative you had to the people's will. So that's why he used the veto as many times as he did. And he vetoed things like rechartering the National Bank. He also was willing to go against what were popular ideas. So Henry Clay had this idea of building this national road. He also wanted to build something called the Maysville Road, which was going to go through Kentucky. which was his home state, and Jackson vetoed it. He was like, if this road's going to go through multiple states, then you call it something that the national government should be involved in. But if it's only going to benefit the state that Henry Clay comes from, no, I'm going to veto it. That the American people need me to veto it because it doesn't benefit them as a whole. So he's going to use the veto more times than any other president before him. Actually, you can take the former 6 presidents, put them all together, and still he is going to veto more times. Not because he believed things were unconstitutional, but he believed they were not right for the common man. So he had a very different vision of how to use this power. So we talk about expanding the power of the presidency, and certainly George Washington, and I would argue Adams and Jefferson very much did so, those first 3 presidents. And then when we get to Jackson, we see that phenomenon again, and we'll see it with Lincoln and several others to come. But these are people who are going to use what is the basic power of the presidency. And in doing so, they're going to expand that power. People had used the veto, but only about dealing with things that were unconstitutional. Nobody who was president had used the veto because they believed it just wasn't right for the American people. When we talk about the parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, the Democrats tended to be pro-slavery, anti-tariff. They were people who also believed in states' rights. And for the most part, Jackson believed in those things. But when it came to the tariff, he actually believed that tariffs could have some benefit for the overall health of the country economically. And that's why he gets involved in this nullification crisis, where he says that if South Carolina threatens not to collect tariffs, he will just get the army as commander in chief to do it. He really is not a purist when it comes to the agenda of the Democratic Party, not like someone like John C. Calhoun would be. But nevertheless, because he was such a strong president and he was a Democrat, he was always a thorn in the side of the Whig Party. And they will lose 3 elections to the Democrats. And by 1840, they will just come to terms with the fact that if you want to win an election, you've got to find yourself someone who could be the common man. You have got to reach out to that voter. It no longer is a system of elites. There's some power sharing that's actually going on. And you can see there's another political cartoon from the nullification crisis. But there were people who looked at nullification, especially Southerners, and this whole notion of states' rights. They believed they had the right to do it. Whereas you will have other people who will say, wait a minute, you're threatening to secede, you're threatening not to pay a tariff, and that's unheard of. That's un-American. You can't do that. So we will see in Unit 5, the whole threat of secession will eventually become a reality. But it was apparent as early as about 1828 that Southerners, especially elite Southerners, really did not like these, what were perceived to be nationalistic policies, which they saw only benefiting the North. And here's another one of Jackson emanating the great power of defunding the national bank. And so in this one, he is vetoing it. We know that he ultimately wins the bank war because even though Congress says, hey, we're going to override your veto, he just simply says, you know what? I'm commander in chief. I'm the president. I'm just going to take the money out of the bank and put it into pet banks, and very easily defunds the bank and wins that argument. Although we know he causes all kinds of economic havoc in the years to come by doing that. Something else to consider with Jackson is this whole notion of the spoil system. So again, that phrase spoil system is what Whigs called patronage. Jackson would have referred to giving jobs to his supporters as patronage or rotation in office. But as of 1828, each time he won the presidency, he was able to put people in place who had supported him in his campaign. Martin Van Buren, when he wins in 1836, will do the exact same thing. And eventually, when the Whigs start winning, they'll fire Democrats and they'll put their people in charge. But for more than 60 years in this country, civil service workers basically changed every 4 to 8 years, depending on who was the president. But Jackson believed that, again, that as president, the executive branch, how do you reward your supporters and make them part of this government experience? he believed by giving them these patronage jobs. Why was it called the spoil system? Because there was so much corruption. You had people doing anything to win elections so that their candidate would give them a job. And then you hopefully got a job that gave you access to money. And there was a lot of theft that went on as a part of this. All right. So we're going to change topics here, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Second Great Awakening. And just like we did in Unit 2, when we talked about the First Great Awakening, there's just a couple of principles. Anytime you hear that phrase, Great Awakening, you know it's a time in American history where individuals are going to suddenly feel this need to engage in church practice. We'll see the creation of new churches. There's usually theologically some sort of new practice or new idea that evolves. So in the First Great Awakening, there was greater focus on the individual's relationship with God and it being an emotionally invested relationship. In our Second Great Awakening, we are going to see the idea of religion is doing. So you are going to make essentially America a more Christian place because you are going to figure out what are the things that are wrong, that need repair, reform, and you're going to put your energies into that. So it's important in terms of cause and effect that we see the Second Great Awakening is the cause of all this reform. So the Second Great Awakening really starts to heat up around 1790, and it's caused by so many people moving west. So by the early 1800s, if I'm living in Ohio or Indiana, I have to build the church. I have to be the person who is going to make religious life a reality there. And for a lot of people, they wanted church. They had had maybe a little bit of church in their life when they came from, grew up in a place like New Jersey or New York. But as young adults going out to a new place, and starting to have families, they really felt the need for the structure of church life. So that was part of their motivation. And like our First Great Awakening, there's always leaders. There's always at least one person who's transformative. So in the First Great Awakening, that was George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. In the Second Great Awakening, it's Charles Finney. And Charles Finney, as a Presbyterian minister, is going to spend a lot of time in and around this area of Kentucky. And he is going to engage early on with revivals. And so these were events that usually lasted a couple of days, and you would have the opportunity to engage in worship, hear choirs, probably witness some marriages and baptisms. And then he will extend that into what he called the camp meeting. And that would usually happen in the late summer, just before harvest time. And people would come sometimes from hundreds of miles around, and you could spend weeks engaging in these practices. Especially if you were looking, you were from Ohio and you were looking to build a church in your community, you would need a minister. So going to one of these camp meetings, like the biggest one they ever had was in a place called Cane Ridge, Kentucky. 40,000 people showed up and spent a month having these experiences. All over New York, you'll have so many people traveling and so many people actually engaging in new religious practices. The Shakers, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Mormons all come from New York. So it's kind of amazing that you have this one state where you have so many people who are trying to create new churches, which is another aspect of a Great Awakening. But the sort of the fire and passion, if you will, of religiosity, it was referred to as the burned over district, this part of New York. But wherever this was happening, it's mostly in the Northeast, to what is the new Northwest. You are going to see also some heightened religious practice in the South as well. You'll also see the AME Zion Church be created, so as the African American Methodist Episcopal Church. So lots of change coming about. And that's really from about 1790 to about 1820. So the children, the young people who experienced this Second Great Awakening, in their adulthood, they're going to be reformers. So they're going to take that idea of religion is doing, and they're going to make it a reality. And again, reform takes all kinds of different problems and attempts to create some sort of solution to them. Another phrase that sometimes is used is the benevolent empire. And it may seem strange because it's so natural. If you think about at AK, basically from the beginning of the school year through much of the year, it seems like there's always something to donate to. There's always some way to give your time or money or resources to help some other group of people in need. But that was not common practice in much of the world prior to the Second Great Awakening. So people would tithe and give money to their church, but it was sort of expected that your church would solve problems. You're poor, you're hungry, go to the church, maybe they'll give you food. With the Second Great Awakening, they were like, you know what? You go to church like one day a week, maybe two. If you go to Bible study midweek, you need to do reform somewhere else. Go out and solve some problem. So for Dorothea Dix, who was the person who was the change agent in this asylum and hospital movement, she was going to raise money. She did investigation of how she saw the treatment of the mentally ill, who unfortunately were put in prison alongside with people who committed all kinds of violent crimes. They were mistreated. She said, we have to build something for these people. So she wasn't expecting her church to do this. She was expecting other like-minded Christian people to give their money and their time and hopefully build institutions for this purpose. When we look at something like temperance, that wasn't always as organized in terms of an institution. It was often just people trying to encourage other people to drink less. There will be some advocates like Neil Dow, who, when he became governor of Maine, said to the legislature, I want to have a dry law. I want to say that you cannot manufacture, sell alcohol in Maine, which they did for a number of years. But these are movements where people say there's a problem. There are people who drink so much that they beat their wives and children and they can't go to work. And we want to make some kind of change. We believe we're going to make America better if we can decrease the amount of drinking that goes on. Certainly abolition, it's very easy to see. But again, the abolitionists, they may have been talking about abolition in church. Maybe their minister often talked about it, maybe had testimonials, invited people who were runaway slaves who would speak about their experience. But the expectation was your abolitionist work, you were going to be doing outside of that time you spent in church every Sunday. We're going to see that there's also going to be desires to solve some other problems like education. That's going to be a big one. And so it starts in Massachusetts, where you have the first public schooling, but it very quickly will sprinkle across the country. But the idea is we're a democracy, and so we should work towards educating our populace. The one movement that's going to be kind of the outside movement is women's rights. So we can see Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott there. They are going to be abolitionists who get into the women's rights cause. They have their Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. They take the language of the Declaration of Independence and they reshape it. And as well as taking what is sort of the preamble to the Constitution and together trying to show that there should be sort of a revolution that takes place to encourage female equality. This was the least readily accepted movement. Of all the reform movements, people saw abolition as far more practical than the teaching of women and equality for women. And again, that might seem a little strange, but when you think about it, the 19th Amendment, that's women getting the right to vote, comes much later than the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which attempt to address and redress slavery. So again, it was not something that was popular, but it definitely shows us that you could take something like abolition and this idea of attempting to create greater equality, and those individuals going, well, wait a minute, I'm trying to bring about a change that's going to end slavery and perhaps create greater equality between Black and white. Well, I'm a woman and there's not equality between me and my husband. So, you know, you see some very interesting combinations here that people who might be involved in one movement might also find themselves involved in another. The other thing to consider is that we're going to see reform happen a couple of times in American history. The first major reform movement is going to be this one that follows the Second Great Awakening. Reformers were upper middle class white people. These women came from well-off families. They had the time and the resources. This isn't to delegitimize what they were saying or doing, but for every middle class, upper middle class white person advocating for, let's say, temperance. If I'm a middle class person, I probably have a servant. I probably have access and easily I can boil water so I can drink tea and coffee. I can purify my water. If I'm a poor Irish immigrant, probably the safest thing that I can drink on a daily basis is alcohol. It's probably easier for me to get access to alcohol than it is to fresh water. As astounding as that may sound, but excuse me, but what it meant was that you often had people who wanted to reform and fix something in society, but it was sort of dislocated from how people were living. So for the abolitionists and all their talk and work and protest, very few of them were actively engaged in things that would, in the long run, actually end slavery, because that kept being seen as sort of what politicians were eventually going to do. So again, middle class, white Christian reform, and sometimes it seemed almost anti-democratic, and especially when it came to things like temperance. People should be able to put whatever they want in their bodies. I mean, that's kind of sort of the understanding in American life. But for those people, they felt that to have a greater democracy, you actually had to put restrictions on people. You had to literally restrict their freedom. And so there are times when we look at reform, not all reform was democratic. I would say abolition was democratic. I would say women's rights was democratic, and sort of education reform as well. But especially that temperance movement, and to a certain extent, the asylum movement might not necessarily have been as democratic. So that takes us on to abolition and focusing on abolition based on the realities of the 1830s, 1840s. So we referred to the peculiar institution, as Southerners called it. But obviously with the market revolution, the focus on cotton textiles, the cotton industry booms, and there is quite the opposite of what people thought in 1790. We don't see slavery decreasing or phasing out. We actually see it increasing. And a lot of that is just simply for natural increase. It's people having people, although they're enslaved people. But we don't have an international slave trade, but we are going to have an internal slave trade that's quite extensive. And it will continue to go as far west as we have slave states in the West and territories that will allow slavery. Some misconceptions. Most of the time, people think that every person who was white and Southern owned slaves, and in actual fact, it was far from it. You had about just a little over 20% of the white Southern population that owned the majority of slaves. And with that, it really means that you have a sort of a power of elite that owns slavery and wants to see slavery continue and will do anything to justify the continuation of slavery. Whereas in the North, the people who were active about seeing slavery end tended to be people who actually weren't connected to the textile industry. If you were an investor in textile machinery, you wanted people to keep growing cotton. And if the cheapest way to grow cotton was maintaining slavery, again, that article that we read, The Lords of the Loom and the Lords of the Lash, you had elites in the North through industry and elites in the South who were slave owners who owned plantations producing cotton. These people had the same agenda. Slavery moving west, they did not see as a bad thing. They saw it as a very good thing. Whether or not that actually was beneficial to the overwhelming majority of the population, black or white. But we can also see that with these numbers, if 76% of 76% of non-slave holders in the South, right? These are people who have no connection to slavery, are still going to be in some way involved in maintaining it. So it's important for us to understand that there is an entire culture that comes to be in the South. People are going to talk about slavery as a positive good. That was John C. Calhoun's phrase. And what he was speaking about was ultimately the slave population by 1830 was a little over 2 million people. And the idea that these people would one day be free, that they would coexist side by side with whites was just seen as untenable. And so anything and everything was used to justify and speak around the phenomenon of slavery and not deal with it head on. We're also going to see that in the antebellum period. And I think this is a good pictograph that gives us a lot of information. But in the South, you are going to see that the average person had slightly less money than the average person in the North. You're going to see the value of a slave radically change over the period of 1830 to 1860. And that's part of the justification for maintaining slavery. For someone who owned 10 slaves, 100 slaves, they would say, if you abolish slavery, I'm losing, potentially 16,000, 160,000, more than $1 million in assets. Who's going to pay for that? Is the government going to pay for that? So obviously, abolition, it's a moral issue, but very easily you can see that economically that there was no real incentive for slavery to end. Actually, quite the opposite. You also can see that in terms of the population as a whole, that white and Black, you have about the median age is about the same, in part because you have a lot of enslaved women having children in this period and essentially being forced to do so. So there's a lot of other sociological difficult things to accept with slavery that just simply were pushed to the side. We talked in class quite a bit about how fear was used in order to motivate those who didn't own slaves to still maintain the institution of slavery, create in people's minds that you could never actually end slavery because it would be too dangerous to the fabric of white society. And that's a big part towards why we will have the Civil War. So another area of reform, we talked a little bit about women's rights. And it's important to also remember women's roles. So gender roles, we'll talk about those quite a bit in this course. But why we're describing gender and being assigned roles is because it is another byproduct of the market revolution. So when work becomes dislocated from the home, the first group of people who no longer work in the home are going to be men. And men already occupied a sphere, as they called it, outside of the home because men could meet socially, men could vote. And now they're going to work outside of the home in this sphere as well. So the women's sphere is basically the home. That's essentially the realm that they are given. And what we would kind of just refer to as sort of the middle class housewife, although there's very few of those people left in the United States in sort of modern times, that role of the caretaker, the raiser of children, who does these decisions and raises children outside of the purview of men because they're not there, they're at work. That's what becomes a reality. So we begin to see by about 1840, people talk about the women's sphere, which is in the home, and the men's sphere, which is the space they occupy outside the home for work and civic engagement and voting. But gender roles in terms of motherhood and adult women engaging in motherhood, and that being that they aren't working, that this is the most important role that they can achieve, that is going to become a cultural norm through the media of the day. And you can see my pictures on my screen, reinforced these ideas. The magazines and newspapers of the day often were geared towards things that would pertain to simply to women and their roles as those who cook and raise children and maintain a home. We also see that the role of father is, especially in this picture, I think is a great one, where father is home right now in the evening. They're reading the Bible together, but that essentially dad just makes an appearance here and there. And in some ways, if there is something that could come out of those gender roles, is that women are seen sort of as experts as the home. And so it's part of the reason why we'll see over time more and more women get involved in talking about something like abolition or get interested in discussing things like temperance, because as caretakers of children, they can talk specifically about what it would be like to be a woman and have your children taken away from you because they're property and they don't belong to you if you're an enslaved woman. They can have empathy and speak about, well, what happens to a woman who doesn't work outside the home, doesn't have her own money and resources, and her husband drinks away half his paycheck, and when inebriated is abusive. So we are going to see that some of the reform that does happen in this period, some of it is seen as acceptable for women to participate in. Dorothea Dix and being involved in the asylum movement, well, women are caregivers. And so therefore she might have some expertise. And it's okay for her to be involved in speaking about those subjects. However, women talking about having greater power and occupying more than the home sphere, women's rights, no, not a popular conception of the day. We talked a little bit in a couple of different ways about culture and American identity. And so I wanted to talk about the four images and the quotes that are on my screen. So probably the most important thing that I swear to you will pop up at some point, it's probably the only question one ever gets about art on the AP exam, is this Hudson River School. But this is an image of the Hudson River circa 1830. And just understanding that there is an American landscape that there are many people are afraid is going to just disappear. The market revolution is coming. You can see, especially in the Northeast, that there are areas that once were not well inhabited, have been utterly changed because of the market revolution. Rivers dammed up, forests cut down. And so you're going to see a whole school of artists, most of them who lived and originally painted around the Hudson River, want to capture this space and basically demonstrate the power of nature, the beauty of nature. It's really a reaction to the market revolution. And although those people will go on and paint scenes all over the United States, and in some cases all over the American continent, both North and South, they're always referred to as the Hudson River School. But it's this idea that we should elevate nature, that we can't forget nature. This does not mean people were environmentalists, but simply that they felt that the natural landscape of America, that in many ways had been untouched, should remain untouched, that there was great power in nature. And it kind of dovetails into the nonfiction literary movement of the time, which would be transcendentalism. So when we look at someone like Ralph Waldo Emerson, I think this is a great quote, to be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment. But Emerson, the transcendentalist, wanted to speak about individualism. The market revolution and the factory system really didn't treat people as individuals. You were a worker and you worked with dozens, if not hundreds of other people, and you all worked at the same time and you operated machinery and you did the same task repeated over and over and over again. And so both transcendentalism and the Hudson River School of Painting are both reactions to the market revolution. One focused on kind of looking at the individual and maintaining individualism, the other one looking to preserve and maintain the beauty and power of this American landscape. We're also going to see some other elements of American identity. So my picture of the White House, this building has changed quite a bit over time, but its original sort of portico with its columns and its pediment, and it looks very sort of Grecian temple-like. It was constructed in the late 1780s, early 1790s, but again, it is the House of the President. The American president is a representative of our democratic mindset in this nation. And so his home reflects those ideas of an earlier democracy, which is ancient Greece. So we see a lot of that Greek revival architecture, and certainly the columns, right? That whole structure of building looks like it could be, you know, on the Acropolis in ancient Athens. We also are going to see that American identity. So Americans today, I think if in class I was asked, you know, I asked you on the first day to write down all the things that make you uniquely American, most students would find that very challenging, because if you live in the United States and you've never lived anywhere else, it's very hard to see yourself as different or having a unique identity. And really the first person to kind of point that out and write about it was Alexis de Tocqueville, who was French. He was a French aristocrat, came to the United States in early 1830 and spent 2 years traveling throughout the nation. He talked to everybody from current presidents and people running for elected office to average common men in places like Virginia and Pennsylvania. And he had a lot of insight. As a Frenchman, he was in a country that now was supposedly a democracy and had gone through a revolution, but he found that Americans were different. The idea that on a Sunday, and certainly on a Sunday in his era, you couldn't find anybody who'd be in their home on a Sunday morning because everybody was at church. And it might not be the same church. He could walk down a street and there'd be 10 houses and 10 different churches these people would attend. But the idea was they all embraced religion, and that was considered important, just as important, as he says in his quote, as liberty, that those two things kind of coexisted. And that they really saw that their ability to go to whatever church they wanted as being essential and confirming how much liberty that they had. And that if they were religious people, that essentially liberty was God granted to them. So he really had insight in American culture in ways that really no one else had articulated at that time. But much of what we see today either are descriptions of American life that still hold true in terms of things like how we value education. He thought Americans were workaholics. They always seem to want to work and make money. And I think that that is still a sort of a stereotype of Americans compared to their European counterparts. But he also was able to look at issues like Indian removal. He also could look at things like slavery and see that sooner rather than later, these would cause problems in American life, and that they weren't things that could just be simply brushed aside. And then the last thing I wanted to just mention, we don't really focus much on this here. We will a little bit later on, particularly in units 5 and 6. But there is a wave of immigration that takes place starting in the late 1830s and early 1840s. And it's mostly people from Ireland. The next biggest cohort of people who are going to come to the United States are German. These people were perceived by white Christian Americans, as especially Protestant Christian Americans, as being people who could never really become American. So if I was from England and I was an immigrant to the United States, it was seen as possible because I would be a Protestant, I'd speak English, that I could embrace the values of American life. But because the Irish were Catholic, and most Germans were either Catholic or Jewish, that these people were conducting their religious practice in languages other than English. So Catholicism was in Latin. At that point in time, Jews with the Hebrew language, both of these cultures accepted alcohol as an everyday part of life, which Protestant Christians at the time, right, were not, because temperance was the norm of the day. And so we are going to begin to see anti-immigrant movements. And they're kind of all under the umbrella of what was called nativism, which has nothing to do with Native Americans. The nativist movement, though, is going to have people who are also connected to things like reform. Most people who were nativists also believed in temperance. A lot of people who were engaged in nativism, they felt that we did not need immigrants, that we had plenty of other people who in the United States could also work for lower wages. They just needed to be freed first. So you're going to see people who were abolitionists who wanted to see slavery end in this country, but they didn't want to see Irish people be able to immigrate here. And we will see that we've always been a nation of immigrants, but who those immigrants are going to change over time. But in the antebellum period, they primarily were Irish and German. And you can see in this cartoon here, we've got a German man and his body is the beer barrel. You've got this Irishman and his body is the whiskey barrel. And they're here stealing an election. There was a lot of assertions that these people, when they came to the United States, that those who were willing to accept them here were only doing so they could one day get votes from them. But there was a lot of anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic rhetoric of the day in the antebellum period. And unfortunately, a lot of it continued for quite some time. All right, so to close out, we were spending sort of the last 4.7 and leading into 5.1 talking about westward expansion and primarily this idea of manifest destiny, this God-given right that the American people are going to as John L. O'Sullivan said, overspread across the country. And we would be a continental United States. And obviously, we'd been sowing the seeds of that for quite some time, right? Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase. We had negotiated some control of this Oregon country away from Spain in 1819. So we were moving across this country. Mexico and their endeavors to encourage American immigration in the 1820s and early 1830s with the settlement, of Texas. But we're going to see that all of this is going to come to a head by the 1830s, really because of the issue of slavery. So Texas, and it eventually becoming the Republic of Texas, an independent country, and then later the 34th state, will be as a result of slavery. The people who go to Texas are people who are from places like Arkansas and Missouri and Louisiana. They are slave owners. They're growing cotton. This is why they want to settle and get cheap, if not free, land as immigrants to Tejas in Mexico. And the Mexican government by 1830 prohibits slavery. These people won't give up their slavery. And so they fight a war for independence, and they win it. And for 9 years are an independent country. But that's going to spill over. So as Texas becomes part of the United States in 1845, there's going to be great disputes over the land. What is Texas? Mexico says Texas is just going to be this little green piece here. The people who settled in Texas, those Americans, are going to say, nope, we're getting all of this. We're going all the way to the Rio Grande, and we're going to go as far as basically what is central New Mexico today. And that eventually will lead to the Mexican-American War, which the United States will win. And in winning it, will actually gain all of this yellow, which when ceded to the United States becomes known as Mexican cession. But those slavery debates that are always tied to westward migration, they continue on and they just intensify. So we are going to stop there. If there are some sort of general questions, I will take those. I know that this unit is a monster because it is thematic. We want to just kind of keep in mind that the vocabulary is key. So if you can, and it's part of the reason why Unit 4 was laid out the way it was, with those lessons each day, what is the vocabulary tied to those lessons? So when I get a question on the exam that is about the market revolution, then I'm thinking about, okay, I know that also has to do with the transportation revolution. I know it has something to do with tariffs in the American system. I know that there's going to be inventions like the cotton gin, interchangeable parts, all of those ideas. If I can kind of associate those with those themes, it's just one of those things that may make it a little easier for when you're testing. The Second Great Awakening, knowing that that's connected to reform, what are the what we consider the principles of a Great Awakening? What were they uniquely for this antebellum Second Great Awakening? That's a very useful strategy. Other questions. So I'm trying to go through my chat and see what is there. And I may have skipped over something. So if I did at some point, let me know. And I'm going to stop my share here for a second. Anything in general. So I just want to make sure that we know it's 25 multiple choice, and then we're going to do 2 SAQ. One of those will involve us taking 2 authors that are talking about history. So they are people writing today or looking back on history. So 2 historians, and comparing and contrasting and connecting their work to the themes of Unit 4. And then we will also interpret an image. Okay, so every class will do that. How long will we have? So we're going to take 30 minutes for our multiple choice, and we'll take 30 minutes for SAQ. So you'll have about 15 minutes for each. I'll give you both, and then you can use that time as you like with some gentle reminders about making sure that you don't spend too much time in one area. But that is our grand plan. I know that I did not touch every single piece of vocabulary that was part of that unit, but I tried to get some of the bigger ones that tie to our themes. couple of things that you're going to see tomorrow when you look at Canvas. There will be this slideshow and presentation, so that'll be recorded and posted. There's also objective and mastery questions. So these are not assigned questions, but they are questions that when answering them, if you attempt to use your vocabulary to answer those questions, it's again a great way of tying the theme to the vocabulary. So they're there if you want to kind of practice with them, or if you have questions or want to ask, you're welcome to do that. I've also put in a bunch of things in my AP. So I put in quite a few different videos. So if you were absent and instead of watching my 45-minute or hour-long lecture, you just want to get a brush up of like 20 minutes on the institution of slavery and abolition reform in the 19th century. They're broken up in those kinds of topics. There's a few practice multiple choice as well. And again, those are things that you are welcome to avail yourself to, but it's all set up in my AP for you if that's what you're interested in practicing with. Okay. All right. Anything else before we close out? We just hit the 1 hour mark. So I don't want to take up any more of your time. But I appreciate that you came on. I know that you have lots of other things going on at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday night. But if you have friends who say, how did it go? And you felt this was beneficial, please direct them. Say go and either listen to it or watch it. Because I think often it's helpful just to have a little sort of refresher before you walk in to take a test. Okay. And if other questions come up over the next sort of 24, 48 hours, please ask them. You can always email or put them out on Remind or ask in class. Okay. So if there is nothing else, thank you for tuning in.
I've got one question.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, Luca. Go ahead.
What effect did this concept of individualism stemming from the transcendentalism movement have on American society?
I would say that the transcendentalists, for the most part, were abolitionists. And so the idea of this is not simply slaves, this is not property, but they're people. I would say that would be a really strong connection between that understanding and value of the individual, and how does it tie into the sort of the historical movements of the day. I don't know if that was exactly what you were looking for.
That makes sense. Thank you.
And if you think about like Emerson and Thoreau, like they were actually part of the utopian movement and created essentially a free society, a farm community in Massachusetts called Brook Farm, where everybody was a communist society. So everybody equally owned the property, black and white. They all had voting power and decision-making power. So I would say that probably abolition is really sort of the closest intellectual, political connection to what the transcendentalists were attempting to advocate in that time. That's a good one. Anything else?
I also have a question.
Go ahead.
So I did those like abolition practices in Canvas, and I had like a hard time like knowing which article went with like which abolitionist. So is that something important to like?
You always get sourcing information when you take an AP test. So whether that's my version of a test or the College Board's. Yeah. But I wanted you to see, some people are very good in terms of picking up on sort of the subtleties of language. So for instance, the one that's David Walker, if you're reading it and you're kind of looking, you're attuned, you know that there's some abolitionists who utilize the language of the Declaration of Independence and Enlightenment thought and revolution to articulate the need for abolition. That's David Walker. Somebody who was an immediate abolitionist in every way, shape, or form. Actually, their newspaper is behind me. That's what's actually on my wall, is a copy of the Liberator. But Mr. William Lloyd Garrison always talked about he would be heard. I shall be heard. I shall be heard. He was very fiery and adamant about literally immediate abolition. If you're reading something that has a fictional overtone to it, and it's sort of in novel form, it's usually Harriet Beecher Stowe. So whether you got them correct or you missed them, what we were trying to do was just to see, taking what were your notes could you kind of say, okay, all of these people are abolitionists, but of these names, which of those, essentially in the way that they wrote, how does it connect to the way they practice abolition? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So
that makes
you're going to have, if you had a quote by Harriet Beecher Stowe, it would say source Harriet Beecher Stowe
okay.
on the test or the exam, but we just wanted to see what people could do.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? Okay. All right. Well, then we will sign off. And again, if you have questions over the next couple of days, please ask them. I'm sure if you have a question, lots of other people would appreciate the answer as well. Okay. Y'all have a good night. And we'll see you tomorrow or Friday. Bye, guys.